Friends and colleagues, welcome to Singapore Perspectives 2015. This year's gathering takes place on the 50th anniversary of Singapore's founding as a sovereign, independent state. The theme of the conference is choices. What might have been and what has been, and what that tells us of what might be, of what could be. What parts did we take over the past 50 years, and what parts we didn't, and what that tells us of the parts that we might take over the next 50 years. This is a conference at once about our past as well as about our future. We look back so as to look forward. The conceptualization of this year's Singapore Perspectives was not done by me or my senior colleagues at IPS. It was the work of our junior colleagues, our interns and research assistants, among them Min Wei, Zheyang, Ekiat, and Hamsia. I want to thank all of them, as well as Su Fen and IPS research fellow Dr. Carol Soon, who mothered them all and kept everyone else more or less in line. Next, I thank our sponsors, GIC and Keppel, Temasek and NTUC Enterprise, and all the others we have listed on the backdrop behind me. Singapore Perspectives has become something of a signpost in the national annual calendar. Invariably held in January, the conference has come to signify, like the Roman god of beginnings and endings, Janus, after which January is named, a pause in the calendar, a moment to look back as we look forward. We couldn't have made Singapore Perspectives such a hinge without the support of our sponsors, almost all of whom have been with us for many years, through good times as well as bad. On behalf of our special advisor, Professor Tommy Koh, and everyone else at IPS, my heartfelt thanks to all of them for their unstinting generosity. And finally, the speakers at this conference, my old friend Bilahari Kausikan and Evelyn Goh, Tan Kong Yam and Linda Lim, and the two distinguished chairs of the panels, Professor Tan Tai Yong and Lee Suan. The debaters we have lined up, Kishore Mahbubani and Tong Yi, Eugene Tan and Vikram Khanna, and their chair, Deborah Soon. The young team from the School of Interactive and Digital Media at Nanyang Polytechnic, who produced the little documentaries you will see in a little while. Yan Ling, Casey, Vanessa, Jack, and Chen Xian. Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hean and Minister for Social and Family Development Chan Chun Sing, who will be with us this afternoon. And lastly, Irene Lim, Kia Ming, and all the rest of the IPS admin team who've been toiling away for months organizing these events. To all of them, a big thank you. And of course, you, the audience, turning up at 8:30 a.m. on a Monday morning, taking time off from your work to attend a conference portentously titled Choices, well, I'm grateful. There are many in the audience who come every year. I'm happy to greet them all as familiar friends. Some are new, including Attorney General V.K. Raja. It is gratifying we have an audience of almost 1,000 from many walks in life, the public sector, NGOs, schools, universities, polytechnics, and ITEs, civil society, and the corporate world. I hope this conference meets your expectations. 50 years ago today, our future was uncertain. We didn't know it then, but on February 26, 1965, the Singapore Cabinet debated a paper that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had written on possible constitutional rearrangements in Malaysia. 1964 had been tense. The People's Action Party had contested the Malaysian general election in April 1964, but won only one seat among the 9 it contested in Peninsular Malaysia. In July 1964, and again in September, Singapore exploded in racial riots, killing a total of 36 people and injuring 560. Singapore and Kuala Lumpur clashed repeatedly in the federal parliament, in the media, and on the ground. Singapore saw no economic advantage in merger, the reason why we had joined Malaysia in the first place, believing a small island could not survive without a hinterland. For example, the Economic Development Board had to seek permission from Kuala Lumpur to award pioneer certificates to prospective investors here, entitling them to tax-free status for 5 to 10 years. In the 2 years we were in Malaysia, only 2 out of 69 such applications were approved, and one came with so many restrictions it amounted to a rejection. Dr. Goh Keng Swee recounts in his oral history a conversation he had with a World Bank expert who was advising Kuala Lumpur and Singapore on the common market. Suppose the Malaysian Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin does not play the game and the common market does not get off the ground. What happens? Dr. Goh recalls asking the World Bank expert. The expert answered presciently thus: in that event, Mr. Minister, it's not the common market which should be in danger, the whole concept of Malaysia would be in danger. By December 1964, the Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman was already sounding a warning. If the politicians of various colors and tinges and flashes in Singapore disagree with me, the only solution is break away, he said in a speech to the Medical College in Singapore. 10 days later, on December 19th, he spelled out to Mr. Lee privately what he meant by breakaway. Singapore was to be in partnership, independent, but part of the peninsula. In other words, a confederation, not a confederation, not a federation. The Singapore government was to have all the powers it had in the years of self-government between 1959 and 1963, prior to joining Malaysia. Kuala Lumpur would be in charge of only defense and external relations, as the British had been, and both governments would share responsibility for security in an internal security council. Singapore citizens would not participate in Malaysian politics, and Malaysian citizens would withdraw from political activity on the island. This was the substance of the paper Mr. Lee presented to his cabinet on January 26, 50 years ago today. Mr. S. Rajaratnam and Dr. Toh Chin Chai vehemently opposed the proposals, but the majority of the cabinet supported the idea, according to Mr. Lee. They saw disengagement as a way to avoid bloodshed. But the proposal floundered for a number of reasons. One, it soon became apparent that the Tunku wanted Singapore out of the Malaysian Parliament altogether. But he wanted Singapore to contribute to the cause of Malaysian defense, with a portion of Singapore's tax revenue going to Kuala Lumpur. There could be no taxation without representation, Mr. Lee told the Tunku. We cannot become a colony in Malaysia. Two, Kuala Lumpur wanted Singapore out of Malaysian politics, but it wasn't prepared for the quid pro quo, Malaysia out of Singapore politics. Their fundamental precondition, Mr. Lee was to write in his memoirs decades later, was that not only in Malaysia, but even in Singapore itself, the PAP would stay out of the Malay world and leave it entirely to UMNO to deal with the Malays, even in Singapore. And finally, the British got wind of the talks and scuttled everything. They were defending Malaysia against Indonesia's confrontation, and they weren't prepared to see their rear disintegrate while they defended the frontier. Instead of a looser confederation, what they wanted was a national government with PAP ministers in the federal cabinet. What would have happened if the British had not scuttled the confederation idea? There was a reasonable chance that the two parties, Singapore and KL, might have come to an agreement. We cannot say with certainty 50 years later, but it is probably fortunate that the confederation idea collapsed. It would have given us one country, two systems, decades before Deng Xiaoping proposed it for Hong Kong. Only in this case, it would have been an arrangement between two peoples who had perhaps less in common than Hong Kongers have with PRC Chinese today, despite which, see what difficulty the special administrative region has had. In retrospect, it may seem obvious that with the confederation idea having collapsed by February 1965, separation 6 months later was inevitable. But there was nothing inevitable about any of it. As uncomfortable as the Malaysian leaders were with separation, there was always at the back of their minds a fear that Singapore out of Malaysia was a worse possibility than a Singapore in Malaysia. Indeed, a few years after separation, both the Tunku and Tun Razak were to express regret for having let Singapore go. And as glad as the entire Singaporean leadership, indeed almost all Singaporeans, were to become that Singapore had extricated itself from Malaysia, that wasn't the consensus view, even within the PAP at that time. Singapore shall forever be a sovereign, democratic, and independent nation, the proclamation read on August 9th, 1965. On August 8th, there were many among the 10 who signed the separation agreement who doubted if Singapore should ever be an independent nation, let alone be independent forever. The desire for independence came the day after, on August 10th. There were at least three views within the Singapore leadership then. One, a group that felt that since the common market wasn't in the offing, merger was literally useless. Trying to make a political success of an arrangement that lacked an economic rationale was pointless. Dr. Goh Keng Swee seems to have been the first Singaporean leader who arrived at this conclusion. He was instrumental in effecting the extrication of the albatross around our necks that Malaysia had become. Others who held this view included Mr. E.W. Barker, who was to draft the separation agreement, and Mr. Lim Kim Sun. Two, a more pronounced political group that believed with every fiber of their being that Singapore was an inextricable part of Malaysia, and they owed it to the millions they had mobilized in both East and West Malaysia to fight on, unbowed and dauntless for a Malaysian Malaysia. Dr. Toh and Mr. Rajaratnam in particular held this view, as did Mr. Ong Pang Boon. They signed the separation agreement with a heavy heart, impelled more by loyalty to the movement and Mr. Lee than conviction that separation was the right course. It is next to impossible for almost all of us here to understand the depth of these sentiments. History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days, Churchill once wrote. Let me speak personally for a moment to try to revive some of these echoes. My father, Devan Nair, was the only PAP candidate to have won a seat in the 1964 Malaysian general election. Therefore, when separation came, he was the only Singaporean leader with a seat in the Malaysian parliament by virtue of representing a constituency in the peninsula, not Singapore. Dr. Goh had arranged with Tun Razak that no PAP MP would be present in the Malaysian parliament when it voted on the separation bill. But Mr. Devan Nair, however, attended and declared that Malaysia might have separated from Singapore, but it had not separated from him. In a speech interrupted many times by the government benches, he spoke of a wrench in the heart and announced he would remain in Malaysia and continue fighting for a Malaysian Malaysia. Thus, the PAP in Malaysia became the Democratic Action Party, or DAP, now the largest opposition party in Malaysia. Contrary to rumors then and now, this decision to remain behind in Malaysia was his and not that of the Singapore leadership. It took another 2.5 years for Mr. Lee to persuade him to return to Singapore. Mr. Devan Nair announced in May 1968 that he was resigning as DAP Secretary General and would not recontest his seat in the Malaysian Parliament in the next GE. He returned to Singapore and NTUC in 1969. He was the last among Singapore's leadership of that time to accept that separation was irreversible. He was 45 when he finally received his IC. He had believed till then that he was a Malayan. So had all the founding fathers of Singapore, including Mr. Lee. He had said on August 9, 1965, that he had fought for merger all his adult life and that he would always look back on that day as a moment of anguish. After the idea of a looser confederation had floundered in February 1965, Mr. Lee had adopted a strategy fraught with enormous risk. To himself and his colleagues, including the possibility that he might have been bumped off, as then British Prime Minister Harold Wilson recognized. He decided to raise the stakes considerably. Either the Malaysian leadership settled on our terms a non-communal, multiracial, and multi-religious polity, or they had to let us hive off, to use a phrase of the Tunkus. So Mr. Lee backed the Malaysian Solidarity Convention that Dr. Toh and Mr. Rajaratnam had formed, linked up all the non-communal parties, political parties in Malaysia, and didn't let up on the campaign for a Malaysian Malaysia. If anyone tried to start another riot in Singapore, they would have to account for the possibility of riots spreading to all the urban centers in the peninsula. In the meantime, Dr. Goh, who had begun talks with Tun Razak on July 13 or thereabouts, told the Tunku's key lieutenants they should settle fast before Mr. Lee became irretrievably committed to the Malaysian Solidarity Convention and won more support for the PAP both at home and abroad in the Commonwealth. The Tunku himself had by then concluded that he wanted Singapore out of Malaysia and had asked Tun Razak to pursue all options, including outright separation with Dr. Goh. Dr. Goh, committed as he was by then to independence, took the bull by the horns, got a letter of authorization from Mr. Lee to pursue all options with the Malaysian leadership, ignored the idea of a looser confederation, plumbed straight for separation, suggested all the necessary constitutional instruments be put through the Malaysian Parliament on August 9th, and insisted on absolute secrecy, especially from the British. Within little more than 4 weeks, a constitutional coup, or negotiated separation, as the draftsman of our independence, Mr. Barker, put it in his oral history, was encompassed. I have said elsewhere that these months, from January to August 1965, was the founding generation's finest hour. And I'm not referring here only to the leaders of that time, but also to the electorate that coalesced around them. For if Singaporeans had allowed themselves to be cowed, we might still have been offered one country, two systems as late as August 1965. Fortunately, our forefathers were a pride of lions led by lions. Why do I recall this history? to remind ourselves there was nothing inevitable about our founding. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present, the poet T.S. Eliot wrote. A people who forget their history will perish. I fear we might well become such a people. Raised in clover and accustomed to success, our elite especially have come to regard themselves as self-created, self-sustaining, self-perpetuating entities. What is, they have no antecedents, history is bunk. So they come to believe, for instance, that we were never vulnerable, that vulnerabilities are myths, lies. Only a people who forget their history can delude themselves so. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Consider this. We came close to getting one country, two systems before we stumbled on separation. All our founding leaders initially believed Singapore couldn't survive without a hinterland. They only abandoned the idea when it became obvious a common market with Malaysia wasn't on the cards. Even then, it hadn't occurred to them the world could be our hinterland. Or if it had occurred to some of them, they didn't as yet know how to give effect to that vision. The notion of a global city was some years away, globalization decades. That we could be a hub in a variety of fields, that MNCs could be our ticket, that we could be the center of this, that, or the other, none was obvious. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. What might be that one end, which is always present? It means the parts not taken as well as the parts taken remain always possibilities now. It means the risks avoided, the successes attained, the dangers circumvented, the achievements chanced upon, all are never wholly voided or erased. It means our history, for 50 years now, a triumphant arc that bent always towards sunlit uplands and fresh pastures, our history can still turn tragic. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. The one constant in our history has been our audacity. Pray they may always remain so. Thank you very much.
The Institute of Policy Studies conducted a survey on the perceptions of Singapore history. The list of events occurred between 1819, from the founding of modern-day Singapore, to the last general election in 2011. The sample of historical events were chosen from a wide range of sources. The survey was conducted between August and October 2014. Face-to-face interviews were conducted with more than 1,500 Singaporeans. The people polled were representative of Singapore's population. They were asked for their views on 50 significant events in Singapore's past. For each event, we asked the respondents if they were aware of it, and if so, whether they thought that was an important part of our history. In addition to the survey, we held 3 focus group discussions with Singaporeans of all ages. The focus group discussions provided more in-depth and intimate insights to the survey findings. Here are the 10 most important historical events as voted by the people of Singapore.
Majora Singapura is our identity.
Each time, especially like during National Day, when all these like national songs are being sang, it will like brings up memory of our past, our childhood, and things like that.
You are in a place, in a country that being recognized by the rest of the world, and it should feel proud.
In the first place, why HDB is formed is not to move the kampong to the HDB, but is to provide citizens with a cheaper housing in a better environment.
All these racial discrimination laws, right, I think they wouldn't have been created if the racial riots hadn't happened. Future generations definitely need to know, like, racial discrimination laws didn't just pop out of nowhere. The current peace that we have, right, was actually built upon these events.
I remember someone comments over the other side after we break away from Malaysia. They said Singapore cannot survive without Malaysia, but we proved them wrong.
So we stay as one, united as one.
I always nurture my younger generation that, united is power. We have to love each other like brothers or sisters no matter what race or religion. That's how the pledge was formed.
National service is very important. This national service instills the sense of belonging.
If your army is strong, people feel safe to invest in your country. That is what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had said.
Airport is done well, and our airport is still well.
I feel very proud about Singapore, especially the airport.
We are being recognized as having the best airport in the world. So I strongly feel that if Changi Airport was not built, we wouldn't have where we are today. It is a very, very important infrastructure because I myself took the very first train ride on the MRT, and the feeling was tremendous because I never felt the speed of that transport. Was a time that we had to get our water source from our neighboring countries. And there was one day my dad was reading the newspaper and said, "Oh dear, we're not going to have enough water one day because the treaty is, it's nearly coming to an end." And that sets me thinking that water is such an important resource.
I think events like SARS outbreak is pretty important because we can have any other diseases like our recent Ebola. So I think some of these points we can make it as a lesson learned to prepare ourselves for future.
We have just seen the 10 most important historical events voted by Singaporeans. Each of them shows a snippet of our collective memories. Events that are judged as important respondents are also regarded as crucial for the future generations of Singaporeans. For example, the SARS outbreak, the launch of the MRT, and the creation of the National Pledge. In the next video, we'll show you the dynamics that influence how we view our past and the decisions we make. Now we will explore the underlying forces that shape how history is interpreted, and thereby offer us a glimpse to the journey that we travelled in the last 50 years. In the IPS survey on perceptions of Singapore history, we have analysed how respondents assign rating scores to the importance of historical events. Results show that Singapore histories are broadly categorised according to three major themes: nation building, differences, and national resilience. Nation-building events highlight the progress and developments that we achieved over the years. These include the physical infrastructure that we built, like the MRT and Changi Airport, and the symbols of nationhood such as the creation of the National Pledge and separation from Malaysia.
I absolutely love it on a personal level. I made one of closest friends. I made commercial service. Funnest stories is commercial service. I was in civil defense, so lots of fun.
They need to feel that they are part of Singapore, and they will prepare themselves to get ready to fight if anybody can protect the country.
We are being recognized as having the best airport in the world. So I strongly feel that if Changi Airport was not built, we wouldn't have where we are today with traveling and being a traveling hub, because friends throughout the world that I have and know, they give such high praises and high quality of service in Singapore. It is a must stopover or layover airport as well, as compared to our Asian counterparts.
Historical events that embody differences are episodes that showcase contestations, disagreements, and dilemmas. Examples include the Stop at 2 birth control policy, bilingualism, and racial riots. For instance, older Singaporeans did not rank bilingualism policy as important, but younger Singaporeans did. Similarly, there are contrasting views on the Stop at 2 policy. Some Singaporeans think that the policy was necessary, others believe otherwise.
The mistake of Stop at 2 was not right, in a way. Because after that, they asked us to get more children.
Let me correct this. It's not a mistake. Now, during that time, my parents, they have to take care of me. How many kids? And you just cannot afford.
Lastly, events that fall under national resilience highlight the challenges that we have overcome as one people. Examples include the cable car accident and the Bukit Ho Swee fire.
Because New gave us a lot of impression because of the combination of teamwork. Even the cable car had a lot of, the forces itself, whether it's the police, whether it's the Marine or civil defense, firefighters, all was involved.
As Singapore celebrates its Golden Jubilee this year, it is an opportune time to reflect upon the choices we have made over the last 50 years. What were the trials and tribulations that we experienced? How did we become a nation, not just a state? How did this place become home? Each historical event along that trajectory, from our founding to now, be the formation of HDB, the Jurong Industrial Estate, MRT, the Bukit Ho Swee fire, or our transformation from third world to first, each helps us to understand ourselves and our society. They are the anchors that root us to this nation, the hoops that bind us together as a people. Just as we are human because we have memories, we have become a nation because we now have a collective historical memory. This study provides insights as to which pieces of our shared experiences define our commonalities and which do not. It also highlights which historical events are considered significant by Singaporeans. When Mr. Rajaratnam was asked many years ago whether we can create a national identity, he said, "We must first accept the premise that it is an act of faith that a national consciousness is desirable, possible, and inevitable." The founding generation made that act of faith. Their act is fructified in our lives, in our memories. If generations to come are to have a similarly rich collective historical memory, we must renew that act of faith.